Bonjour, my name is Renaud-Philippe Garner. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at UBCO, and this is my teaching assistant, Isabelle. So I expect all the good-hearted and people of good faith will excuse the small noise interruptions that may occur. But today, it's not about Isabelle, but we're lucky enough to welcome Professor Nigel Biggar, a man of many titles. He is the Emeritus Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. He's equally the founder of the Macdonald Center for Theology, Ethics and Public Life at the same august institution. And partisans of Petrarch and Machiavelli can disagree on whether to use his other title, since he's also a member of the House of Lords. For our purposes, it is Professor Biggar's writings that bring us together. He's the author of numerous articles and several books, the latest, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, with the focus of today's discussion. I expect they'll provide us all with much food for thought. Professor Biggar, it's a pleasure to welcome you to UBCO.
Thanks. Thanks for the warm welcome, Renaud-Philippe. Thank you all for coming. If you hadn't, it would be lonely up here, so thank you for coming. So I'm going to speak, I think, for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for you to say what you think or ask questions or make comments as you will. And the title of my talk is Colonialism, Thinking Again. Just to give you a preview of the map, I'll first of all talk about what my moral principles are. Since I'm not a professional historian, I'm a professional ethicist. I deal in matters of good and bad, right and wrong. And my book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, the subtitle tells you it's not just a history, it's a moral assessment. And that is my business. So first of all, I'll lay on the table what my moral principle, my relevant moral principles are. Then I'll talk about, I'm going to focus on the British Empire because that's where I know best, because that's what's most relevant to you here in Canada. But before that, I want to talk about the larger context in which we should consider European empires, because there is a larger context. I'll talk very briefly about the business of judging the past, which is what we're doing when we try and evaluate historic colonialism. Then most of what I say will be summarizing my overall assessment of British Empire, British colonialism, and then I will culminate in focusing on Canada on three issues raised by the Canadian example. So first of all, what are the moral principles I bring to bear on the matter of the phenomenon of colonial endeavor? I should make perfectly clear, among other things, I'm also an Anglican priest. My ethics are Christian. Whether or not you're Christian, you may or may not share my moral principles, but here they are. First of all, I do believe that every human individual has an equal dignity under God, regardless of race, culture, or anything else. There is a basic human equality. However, I don't regard all cultures as equal. I think that a culture that has discovered that the earth is round, not flat, is scientifically superior to one that doesn't, in that respect. Notice this is a discriminate particular judgment, in that respect. I think that a culture that has managed to develop maritime technology that crosses oceans, rather than simply canoes that are stable in coastal waters, is technologically superior to one that hasn't, in that respect. I think that a culture that has figured out that the sexes are equal, that slavery is bad, is morally superior to a culture that hasn't figured that out. And I think that cultures that have figured out how to survive in the Australian bush or the forests of British Columbia is superior to one that hasn't, in those respects. So just to be clear, I think making, as it were, overall indiscriminate wholesale judgments about another culture are probably wrong and prejudiced, but one can, I think we all do, frankly, we all do make a discriminate moral comparison. Another relevant moral principle, or perhaps this is more a principle of anthropology or my view of human being. I regard all human beings as creatures, not gods, limited in knowledge, also as sinners, not perfect, inclined to do wrong things. Therefore, I don't expect any political organization to be perfect. And as you'll find out, I think the British Empire, which stretched from roughly 1550 to 1960, from Newfoundland to New Zealand, did all sorts of bad things, as well as good things. But I challenge you to name me any long-standing state of which that is not true. Another, I guess, anthropological feature or existential one of my thinking is that, yes, sometimes human beings do suffer evil because of someone else's wrongdoing. But a lot of the evil or damage or harm that human beings suffer is tragic and lamentable, but no one's responsible for it. The most obvious instance of that that arises on the topic of colonialism is disease. Europeans spread lethal diseases, particularly in this part of the world, but except on very rare cases, no one intended to do it. It was tragic. It wasn't culpable. And I find when discussing these things, I use the word tragedy and the words tragedy and tragic a lot. Not all bad stuff was someone's fault. Okay, so those are some of the moral principles or views of human being or the human condition that shape my judgment of the matter we're going to focus on. Now, before we home in on European or British empire or colonial endeavor, I want to set it in context. And this is really important because most of the public discussion of these matters completely ignores the context. One context is this. Empire has been a universal form of political organization since the dawn of time, practiced by people of every skin color on every continent. Someone has said, I can't remember who, that probably most people in the course of history have lived under empires. Until a couple of years ago, I was running a research project in Oxford called Ethics and Empire. And the aim of the project was to consider empire from ancient China to the modern period, and to consider how, for example, ancient Chinese people or medieval Arabs, how did they regard the empires of their time? Did they see empire as we tend to, which is, we tend to regard empire as a bad thing? Has that been true throughout history? And if not, why not? One of the very early things that we discovered was, if you're looking for critiques of empire in ancient China or the medieval Muslim world, you won't find them. You will find treatises on what makes for a good or bad ruler, a good or bad emperor, a virtuous or vicious emperor. But empire as a form of political organization was taken completely for granted. So before we home in on the European instance of empire and colonial endeavor, we need to bear in mind just how common a form of political organization it has been in history. And the same goes for the mass movement of peoples. So, I mean, the the reasons why most Canadians are here, the reasons why most of you are here is because many of your people moved from other parts of the world to this place. But the movement of peoples has been, again, a universal phenomenon. So before there was the mass migration of Europeans to North America or to Australia later on in the 1800s, in the 1640s, the Iroquois expanded northwards to, I think, north of the Great Lakes into what was Huron territory, displacing the Hurons, who then dispersed westwards, displacing other indigenous peoples in what was an instance of imperial expansion. Empire is simply one people who expands and dominates others. That's all it is. And the Iroquois expanded and created a kind of empire. In the 1700s, the Comanche in what's now the southwest of the United States expanded, I think, eastward, overwhelming the Apache and creating what one historian describes as a vast slave economy. In the 1820s, the Zulu under King Shaka expanded westward, scattering other African peoples to 3 of the 4 winds and conducting at least one exterminationist war. And in 1835, the Maori sailed eastward from what's now New Zealand to the Chatham Islands, where they encountered the Moriori people, 10% of whom they slaughtered, and they enslaved the rest. When Admiral Arthur Phillip pitched up in Southeast Australia in 1788 with his fleet full of convicts from Britain, he ordered his men to share their catch of fish with the Aboriginal peoples he met there, and he kept open house so Aboriginal people could walk into his house, and he sat them down to eat with him. Things turned bad later on, but the first encounter, in the case of Arthur Phillip and the British in Southeast Australia, was Pacific. So, 2 points here: mass migration of peoples, intrusion in other peoples, universal phenomenon. Sometimes it was brutal, sometimes it wasn't so brutal. What about the motives for colonization? I guess I should just explain the distinction between empire and colonies. I suppose the first colonies we know about were around the Mediterranean, when the Carthaginians or the Romans and Greeks sailed across to different parts of the Mediterranean and established enclaves or colonies. Right, so you could say colonies are an overseas form of empire, where empire in Europe tended to be it didn't cross oceans, it simply annexed different parts of Europe. But in the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, because Europeans had developed ships that could cross oceans, it meant that increasing thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people migrated from Europe, from the British Isles to North America. But why did the English come to North America in the first place? The first enclaves that the English carved out on the eastern seaboard of North America, among the first, were to create naval bases for harrying Spanish shipping. So there you have little Protestant England trying to resist the power of imperial Spain. So ironically, the origins of English empire in North America were anti-imperial. Another motive for Elizabethans setting up camp on the coast of North America at that point was gold. They'd heard tales of piles of gold awaiting them in North America or the Americas, and they were searching for it, which sounds a bit kind of greedy and material and avaricious, maybe. But then in the 19th century, on the gold fields of Western Australia, or the gold fields of Malaya, or the gold fields of California, you found thousands of Chinese people also searching for gold to make their fortunes. Another very early motive for English empire was simply trade. So you have the East India Company going to India to trade, to make a profit, undoubtedly. I'm not a Marxist, so I don't think profit making is wrong. And of course, in these parts, you had the Hudson's Bay Company. What were they doing here? They were here to trade and make a profit. In the 19th century in particular, you do get mass migration. You get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland crossing the Atlantic, most of them preferring to go to the US. Don't know why. She's clearly very excited. Don't know why. I assume they were told that the opportunities in the US were greater. They also may have preferred a warmer climate. But why did they take the risks of crossing the Atlantic Ocean in wooden ships? They were fleeing famine and poverty and social constrictions, and they wanted a better life. That's why migrants cross the English Channel now. That's why people try to emigrate to Canada now. Okay, so those are some of the motives. There are lots of other motives involved in empire that I'll mention in passing shortly. Just a word or two about judging the past. Good moral judgments always pay close attention to circumstance, in the same way that good legal judgments always pay close attention to circumstance. Circumstances make a difference to the meaning of moral principles. So when we're judging the past, we need to remember the past is a foreign country. They did things differently then. And some of what they did we might find appalling and astonishing. I mean, in the past, almost every people did slavery or slave trading. Now that may appall us, but we need to pause and ask ourselves why. I won't explain that right now, but the point is, the past was different, and it wasn't just because people were stupid and morally obtuse. It was partly because their circumstances were very different from ours, and so we need to pay attention to the difference of circumstance. And another thing to bear in mind when we judge the past, I mean, to some extent, we can't help but judge the past in terms of our own moral convictions. We can't help doing that. But we need to be tempered when we remember that their circumstances were not ours. But also, we need to remember that what we now regard as moral common sense, we only believe that because of what we inherited from those who went before us. They had to learn that slavery was wrong. We take it for granted. But there was a time when people did not regard slavery as wrong. They had to learn it. So when we judge the past, pay attention to circumstance and exercise a certain humility. What's clear to us wasn't clear to people in the past. And there may have been good reasons for that. All right. I'm going to summarize for you the conclusion I come to in my book about the British Empire and British colonial endeavor. This appears in the conclusion to the book. So on page 276, you will find a long list of the evils that the British Empire presided over. And these include, yes, about 150 years of slave trading and slavery from 1650 to the early 1800s. Yes, it includes the devastating spread of disease in North America and Australasia. Just on that, though, one American historian reckons that when the North American people experienced successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period in the 1700s, they could be expected to lose 90% of their population. And so the impact of disease on the Americas brought by Europeans, because Europeans were immunized against disease because they were used to living with domesticated animals that people in these parts were not used to. And the impact was devastating. And that was one of the main reasons why eventually European settlers overwhelmed native peoples in terms of numbers. But just to be clear, this wasn't intended. No one intended to do this any more than I think the Chinese intended to kill 7 million people by spreading COVID around the world. I don't think they intended to do that. And of course, it's not just Europeans who spread disease. It's reckoned that smallpox was brought to the Northern Territory of Australia by Indonesian fishermen. But certainly, the spread of disease was one of the greatest evils that Europeans and British colonists brought to these parts. Then, of course, when modernizing Europe with its firearms arrives in North America and encounters peoples who are using bows and arrows, and when the native peoples the populations were devastated and the numbers of settlers increased, the economic, social, and cultural disruption caused to native peoples was shocking. No doubt about it, shocking. And yes, there were elements of racial contempt on the part of Europeans and British for native peoples. And there were instances of land being unjustly taken. There were cases of broken treaties, etc. There's a longer list on page 276. But then on page 277, there's a list of the good stuff. And this is what the current dominating narrative completely neglects. If the British were involved in slave trading and slavery for roughly 150 years, they were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish both slave trading and slavery. The Danes were the second. The French abolished slave trading in 1793. Unfortunately, Napoleon reinstated it 9 years later. The Danes abolished the trade in 1804, the British 1807, but the British then abolished slavery throughout the empire in 1833 and the Danes later. The British then used their dominant post-Napoleonic Wars power, imperial power, to suppress slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. And that included the Hudson's Bay Company on the Pacific Northwest coast, which was charged with opposing slavery, which was endemic among the peoples of the Northwest coast, because the peoples here depended on salmon fishing for their survival. I'm not a fisherman, but I'm told if you fish salmon and you leave it hanging around for long, it doesn't last. So in order to build up supplies of salmon to feed your population throughout the year, you have to process it quickly. And the amount of work required to process the quantity of salmon necessary for survival far exceeded what the women folk of a given indigenous people could provide. Therefore, the indigenous peoples on this coast were constantly involved in slave raiding. and therefore warfare. And the Hudson's Bay Company was charged with opposing that, although I'm told there wasn't much they could do about it. Other positive stuff. One of the benefits of the imposition of an overarching authority, imperial authority, is it suppresses conflict beneath it. So native peoples in Africa and in these parts, when colonial government was imposed and when it was sufficiently strong, it had the benefit of suppressing violence between warring peoples. It also had the benefit, sometimes deliberately, of trying to moderate the impact of modernity on unmodern peoples. It's commonly assumed that colonial government was basically the tool of British business, which isn't true, actually. Colonial governments both in India and in Africa often excluded British business because they did not want local economies to be so disrupted that the government would then have to cope with the unrest. From about 1846 till end of the First World War, the empire promoted free trade. Yes, that allowed English manufacturers of cloth to undercut the cloth produced by Indian artisans in India, which wasn't good for the artisans, but it was good for the Indian consumers because it was cheaper. But by the same token, the free trade allowed Indian entrepreneurs to come to England, send their sons to Cambridge University, observe industrial processes, go back to India, and found the Tata global conglomerate, which now employs 60,000 people in Britain and owns what's left of the British steel industry. The Tata family set up textile mills and steel mills in India in the 1890s under the Raj because of technology they'd got from England. Other benefits, I can list them, but just to make an obvious point, Canada was a creation of British empire and colonialism. Canada now is among the most prosperous and liberal countries on earth, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Britain, and like the US, which was born of the British Empire, even if it didn't stay there. And according to the World Value Survey 2023, which asked two questions of people in 17 nations worldwide, would you object to having immigrants as your neighbor? Would you object to having someone of a different race as your neighbor? And I'm glad to report that the Canadians and the New Zealanders and the Australians and the British are among the lowest in the world, in sharp contrast to China, Russia, and Iran. Point being, among other things, the British Empire exported liberal traditions, ideas, and institutions to New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. It's not surprising, therefore, that these are among the most liberal countries on earth right now. Anyway, so in the course of the book, I end up listing a range of bad things in the debit ledger of imperialism and good things in the credit ledger. And I say, okay, so which weighs more heavily? And my observation is, you can't possibly say. I mean, what quantity of racial prejudice is worth putting up with for the benefits of liberal institutions? How many unjustly killed people in India is worth so many hundreds of thousands of African slaves liberated from slave ships? I mean, you can't do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of this kind because the goods and evils are of different kinds. And that when people are discussing these things, normally they want to say, well, the empire did more good than bad, or more bad than good. And I said, well, you can't do it that way. So that's the first step of my argument. The second is this, and critics of empire, decolonizers, anti-colonialists, they like to say, okay, it doesn't matter how many bridges the British built in India, it doesn't matter that they brought tropical medicine to Africa, because the empire was at its heart racist. So the heart was evil. So it doesn't matter what peripheral accidental goods it brought. And you'll find a strong feature of contemporary popular criticism of British and European empire wants to say it was like the Nazis. Churchill was no better than Hitler. It was like the Nazis. The British conducted genocide in Tasmania. They set up concentration camps in South Africa, and so on. So that the heart was evil, just like Nazism. So I mean, the Nazis. I believe that Hitler had a hand in developing the Volkswagen car. My wife and I drive one. It's a very good car. The Nazis built autobahns. That was good. But none of that compensates for Auschwitz, does it? That's the argument. And by analogy, so were the British. Bridges, tropical medicine, okay, but the heart was racist. Or the heart was exploitative. Or the heart was given to wanton violence. I can't go into the arguments, but I consider those arguments, and I conclude, no, there was nothing in the British Empire equivalent to racism. Excuse me, equivalent to Nazism. You cannot say the heart was evil. Yes, there was racial prejudice. On the other hand, the empire's commitment throughout the second half of its life to the suppression of slavery was based on the Christian assumption that all people are equal under God, regardless of race or the level of cultural development. So you have vying, unsurprisingly, you have vying views, but you can't say, in the same way that you can say of the Nazis, that they really were committed to racist genocide, because in the middle of a world war, even when they were losing, they were diverting material and resources to eliminating the Jews. So central to their vision was that genocidal project. Okay. So the second third argument is saying, no, you can't say the empire was at its heart evil, even if it contained elements of evil. And then the third step is, I say we can say that the empire displayed a number of liberal and humanitarian trends which grew stronger as time went by. So I've mentioned the abolition of slavery in the early 1800s. That then morphed into a general concern with the impact of colonization upon Australian Aboriginals and indeed North American indigenous peoples. In 1837, in London, the Society for the Protection of Aboriginal Peoples was founded. So the concern that people in Britain and in the colonies were aware that the impact of colonizing modernity upon native peoples was really shocking, and they were disturbed by it. So the concern, first of all, for enslaved blacks expands to other peoples who are being disturbed by European modernity. And the goal, and this is controversial, but the goal was, I mean, when two peoples encounter each other, there are, I think, three possibilities of what will happen. Either one people annihilates the other people, um, um, or they separate, or one people assimilates another. And in the British Empire, to my knowledge, there was never any deliberate policy of extermination. The option of apartheid or separation was rejected, and the third option of a measure of assimilation or integration was the policy. Now, I know this is controversial, and we can perhaps discuss this later, but one manifestation of that commitment to integration was the fact that Black Africans were granted the vote in Cape Colony in South Africa on the same terms as whites in 1853. Maori males were granted the vote in New Zealand in 1867 before white males were. And Indians or Indigenous Canadians were granted the vote in Eastern Canada in 1885 by John A. Macdonald or his government. Unfortunately, that was revoked 9 years later by Wilfrid Laurier because apparently all the Indigenous Canadians were voting Conservative. But the point is this: the ideal was Indigenous peoples be gathered into the new society, not excluded, not annihilated, but integrated. That didn't necessarily mean that they had to drop all of their traditional culture, but they had to adapt sufficiently to be part of the new world. Another liberal element of the empire was the spread of liberal institutions of a free press and of freedom of association. So you'll find, whether in Hong Kong or South Africa or India, there are newspapers produced by Chinese and Africans and Indians that are sometimes highly critical of colonial government. You also find a judiciary that could sometimes be fiercely critical of colonial government, for example, during the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya in the late 50s and early 60s. So the empire exported institutions that held government to account to an extent that cannot be found in China or Russia or Iran to this day. Next, as early as the 1820s, the idea is beginning to germinate that the future of the empire can't be a kind of tightly controlled, centralized organization. It has to relax into a body of independent states that are loosely connected through culture. So in the 1820s in India, all of the three major East India ports are governed by Scots. And all of them, each of these Scotsmen can be found to say, we cannot possibly stay here and rule Indians. All we can hope to do is to govern, is to establish sufficiently decent and stable government, and then go with grace and hopefully with goodwill. And by 1917, the idea that the empire would relax into what became a commonwealth of nations, independent nations, was being promoted by Jan Smuts, the guy who invented the phrase Commonwealth of Nations. And of course, by 1930, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa are all virtually independent, and India has been put on the same track. So there is a sense that empire would have to morph into something less dominated and centralized. And then finally, I think it says something important about the mature character of the empire that in 1939, the empire went to war. Against what? Against Nazism in Germany. And between May 1940, when France fell, and June 41, when the USSR was invaded, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. So if you find yourself traveling in northeast Sicily, and you are driving south of Mount Etna, and you're driving eastwards from Regalbuto to Agira, you'll see a cemetery on your left-hand side. And if you pull your car over and get out and walk into the cemetery, you'll find yourself surrounded by young Canadians. And if you walk among the headstones long enough, you'll come across one dedicated to H.R. Anderson, aged 28, killed on the 18th of July, 1943. And I noticed his headstone because it bears the striking epitaph, anti-fascist fighter. He came from Winnipeg. So, and at that time, there was no conscription in Canada. He was a volunteer. He volunteered to fight fascism. Who called him? The Empire called him to fight fascism. So I'm not saying the Empire didn't contain and preside over some serious evils. I'm saying that there were humanitarian and liberal impulses that in the end led to the Empire's dissolution, or at least its morphing into something different. And that its commitment to 1939-45 tells you something important about what it really stood for in the end. So, which brings us to Canada. How much time what time do we have? I've lost track. And what time are we going to finish? Are you happy to have me talk now 15 minutes? I want to make sure we have time for... Oh, fine. Okay, good. Good. So, I mean, there's lots of Canadian history, and you will know a lot of it better than I do, but here are three issues. And the last one will be the residential schools that I'll talk about. Yes, I mean, the first thing to say is, notwithstanding instances of injustice, and that there may well have been the taking of land that shouldn't have been taken, it's wrong to suppose that the encounter between white colonists or white traders and indigenous peoples was always conflict, because it wasn't. So when I was here in March, I met an historian from the University of Northern British Columbia, Ted Binema, who published a book a year or so ago on the Vancouver Island treaties of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s between the Hudson's Bay Company and indigenous peoples. And the story he tells there is that the trading posts the company set up offered indigenous peoples things they wanted, like furs, like weapons, like opportunities to earn wages, like medical treatment, and also offered security, because I mentioned earlier that peoples in the Pacific Northwest were constantly at war because they were raiding for slaves. The company made quite clear it wanted no tribal warfare anywhere near its trading posts. Therefore, its trading posts became zones of security. which indigenous peoples wanted to get close to because it provided security. And when the company started to clear land and cultivate it to feed their trading posts, and when they took an interest in coal deposits in Vancouver Island, the native peoples couldn't care less, because what the trading posts brought to them, they wanted. And they didn't care about coal, didn't really care about land, so long as they had access to fisheries. The point being here, the arrangement suited both parties perfectly well, or perfectly well is too strong, but well enough. And there were no treaties made, but that didn't mean that there wasn't a consensual arrangement that suited both parties, more or less. In fact, it was only after 1850 when the Hudson's Bay Company first offered compensation that indigenous peoples thought to ask for it. Because, of course, when they raided each other for slaves, they weren't accustomed to offering compensation. So that's just one point about relations between Europeans and indigenous peoples. Yes, there was often conflict, but there wasn't always conflict. Next, the reputation of John A. Macdonald. A book came out 12 years ago by James Dashok called Clearing the Plains. And in this book, Dashok argues that Macdonald failed to relieve the famine of native peoples on the Western Plains because of racist prejudice. And the reason there was famine on the Western Plains was because the bison population upon which native peoples depended for their survival had collapsed. Until last week, I thought the reason for the collapse was that there was mainly because there was industrial scale slaughter of bison, mainly in the United States, by Europeans. But someone pointed me to a piece of research that pointed out that there was no industrial scale slaughter of bison in Canada, that the overhunting was done by indigenous peoples using horses and rifles. Tragically, they undercut their own the basis of their own economic survival. Therefore, in the 1880s, some of them were starving. Patrice Dutil did an analysis of the data in Dashok's book and concluded that the number of native Canadians, according to Dashok's own data, who died of starvation on the Western Plains was 45. 45. So that was lamentable, but it was not on a massive scale. Did Macdonald fail to relieve famine because of racial prejudice? Well, according to Jed Martin, retired from the University of Edinburgh, in 1882, which was the year of one of the years of the famine out west, Ottawa was spending more on Indian affairs than it was spending on defense. So it's not clear to me at all that the Ottawa government failed on a large scale to relieve famine. And it's not clear to me at all that insofar as it had failures, that the reason was Macdonald's racist prejudice. After all, Macdonald was the one who argued for the extension of the vote to Indians in Eastern Canada in 1885. And he's on record as saying that he looked forward to the day when Indigenous people would be standing on the floor of the House of Commons. Now, finally, the extremely controversial issue of the Indian residential schools. And I'm going to tell you what I know from what I've read, and I'm open to being contradicted by contrary data. So let me say what I agree with in terms of the criticism of the residential schools. I agree that First Nations kids were sick at these schools and died at rates above the average until reforms were made in the first decade of the 1900s. I also agree that the funding model of the schools, which was per capita, encouraged school heads to over-recruit and therefore overcrowd the schools, and overcrowded schools was unhealthy, which exacerbated the problem with disease. I agree that there were instances where teachers, missionary teachers, were unduly zealous in the promotion of Christianity and unduly disparaging of native cultures. That happened. There appear to have been instances of sexual abuse by staff. That's all lamentable. But here's the other side. The idea of residential schools for Indigenous kids came from Indigenous peoples in the 1830s. Indigenous leaders who recognized that their peoples had to adapt to the new world if they were going to survive. In particular, they had to learn English and they had to learn agriculture. And as late as the 1920s, Indigenous leaders were lobbying for more schools in central Alberta and the Anglican Diocese of Keewatin, which I think is in the northwest or the Northern Territories. So the first thing to note is these schools were lobbied for by Indigenous peoples who wanted them. Same thing is, and the schools are criticized because of the number of deaths of Indian kids. There's a controversy as to what the numbers of deaths really were, and I can go into that if you wish. The 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission reckoned about 3,200. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in the University of Manitoba reckons about 4,100. Out of a total of 150,000 students over 110 years, which amounts to, if we're talking about, well, I can go into the details. But the figures of 3,200 from the TRC and 4,100 from Manitoba are inflated for reasons I can explain, but I won't just say right now. It's now 4 years since the claim of the discovery of mass graves at a site near here in Kamloops was made, and it was claimed that these were the mass graves, or the mass graves of kids who had been at a local residential school. That was in May 2021. To date, no bodies have been exhumed. There's been no exhumation there. There have, I think, been exhumations in 3 or 4 other places. No bodies have been discovered. What we do know, so what happened at Kamloops was that radar, ground-penetrating radar was used and discovered disturbances under the surface of the ground, which were assumed to be unmarked graves. We do know from documents that in Kamloops, on that site, there was a septic system using clay tablets. It is possible that the disturbances are actually clay tablets, nothing to do with graves at all. So as far as I know from the evidence, anywhere, there's no proof of any mass graves anywhere, any unknown grave. And the story that is now pretty much public orthodoxy seems to me to be a false one, judging by the evidence. Yeah. I mean, I can go through, I'm prepared to go through some of the other criticisms of the schools with regard to the suppression of native language. And I've said in some cases, the disparagement of native culture was excessive and unnecessary, disproportionate. On the other hand, if you've ever tried to learn a foreign language, you know that the best way to do it is total immersion. If you want to learn German, go to Germany, don't stay in Canada. And for the same reason, it was reckoned, if you want native kids to learn English, don't leave them at home. Take them to schools where they will be surrounded by English. And it's not true to say that the kids were forbidden to talk their own languages. They were forbidden in the classroom. As for sexual abuse, yes, it appears to have taken place. But according to J.R. Miller, the author of the standard history of the residential schools called Shingwalk's Vision, most of the sexual abuse was not staff on pupils, it was among pupils. And whether it was abuse or not is unclear, because some of the schools were single sex. If you put a lot of adolescent boys together in a single sex dormitory, you will get a fair bit of homosexual activity, without a shadow of a doubt. Was this abuse? Not clear. So the scale of sexual abuse and of proper abuse is just not clear from the evidence that I've read. And there is the claim that Ottawa failed to fund these schools adequately. But I guess my response to that is, it's always easier to complain that government's not funding something properly. I mean, people do it all the time, because there's certain things people want government to fund. But whenever I hear someone saying government's not funding this more, I want to say, okay, if government funds this more, what should government fund less of? Because there's a finite amount of public money. And the other thing, and here's where historical circumstance is relevant. We're all accustomed to extremely strong, well-resourced welfare states. In the 1870s, the United States spent more on the Indian Wars than the whole of the Ottawa budget. In 1914, presently in the UK, the proportion of GDP spent by government is 46%. 46% of GDP is spent by government, public funding. In 1914, in Britain, it was 8%. In other words, in the 19th century, in Canada, the resources available to Ottawa were far inferior to what we now have. So it's possible, it's arguable, that Ottawa should have spent more funding residential schools. Although, as I said earlier, in 1882, it was funding Indian affairs more than it was funding defense. It's arguable, but one mustn't assume that resources were available. Although J.R. Miller himself complains about the meanness of Ottawa with regard to funding these schools, but presents no arguments as to where the funding was coming from and what should have been less funded in order to fund the schools better. In sum, as far as I can tell, the residential schools were not sites of mass murder. They were not sites of large-scale sexual abuse of minors by adults, nor were they sites of the systematic and racist suppression of native language and culture. Their intentions were good, to enable native kids to learn English, learn agriculture, adapt and survive and prosper, although sometimes the execution of the schools was deficient and sometimes culpably so. I'll leave things there. Thank you very much.